No need to be scared, I was just as alarmed as you were to find out that there was a Persona game before Free. Like most people, I assumed the first game in the series being called Free was just a strange style choice, but it turns out there were actually 2 games before it. Well, Free, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Hilarious sarcasm aside, I'm going to be focusing on the first half of the Persona 2 story, being Persona 2 Innocent Sin. As much as I would love to say that there's a lot to discuss about Persona 1996 and Persona 2 Eternal Punishment, for this topic at least there isn't. In truth, we don't have to imagine how Atlus would treat gay romance in Persona because they've already included it in Persona 2 Innocent Sin, with one of the few romance options in the game being Jun Kurosu. Jun is a pretty pivotal character in Persona 2, so any detail about him is a spoiler, including that he joins the party about halfway through the game after being freed from the influence of Innocent Sin's antagonist. But more relevant to this topic, Jun is unapologetically gay, and the game makes no secret of this. He is repeatedly framed as being a rival in love by Lisa for the protagonist Tatsuya's affection. Other party member Eikichi tells him he's laying it on thick when Jun is complimenting Tatsuya. He gets excited anytime Maya compares him to Tatsuya. It's not really a proper source, but here's his wiki page saying Jun is heavily implied to be gay. Tatsuya and Jun's personas are even themed after the heirlooms that they entrusted to each other and still treasure in the present. Tatsuya even uses Jun's lighter in one of his animations. There's more I could say, but I don't really need to give evidence because Jun is a romance option. During the tourist temple, Lisa asks Tatsuya who he has a crush on. If you answer Eikichi, this is treated like a joke. But if you choose Lisa, Maya, or notably Jun, the answer will be taken seriously. From then onwards, when given the opportunity, the game will refer to them as lovers during demon negotiations, leading to the demons treating the pair as a couple, with there even being unique dialogue for demons acknowledging that they're both men, voicing their support, or lack thereof. This doesn't just mean that Jun is the first openly gay romance option in a Persona game, but it also means that Tatsuya, the game's protagonist, is bisexual as well. A common detractor of Jun and Tatsuya is that Jun's romance option was only included to attract fujoshis, female fans of BL and or yaoi. This comes from an interview with Atlus from around the time Persona 4 was released asking about Jun.
We created that scene as an experiment to see how players would react to this particular scenario. There is a subculture within female Japanese fans of anime and comics where they value romantic relationships between fictional male characters in a different way than in real life gay culture. We were wondering if we could satisfy those fans.
This quote can't be attributed to a specific member of staff since the interviewee is only ever listed as Atlus, so we have no clue to what extent this person worked on Innocent Sin. However, this is still the closest thing we have to an explanation of why Jun was included as a romance option. So Jun might have been made an option to attract fujoshis. Hey, maybe even fudanshis too, we don't know for sure. That doesn't change the fact that Jun is an incredibly well written character with a fleshed out personality and backstory who plays a pivotal part in Innocent Sin, and he happens to be head over heels for Tatsuya, and Tatsuya, an equally well written protagonist, can reciprocate these feelings, and it's not played for laughs, if we overlook some funny demon negotiations at least. This isn't the only respectful representation included in Persona 2.
Lisa's character arc brought awareness on the issues of xenophobia and race fetishization. Akichi being a fan favourite has also shown to be a complex character. His character story and his relationship with Miyabi Hanakoji have contributed to the elements of body positivity, delivering awareness on eating disorders, body stigmatization, and the harmful effects of bullying.
Jun and Tatsuya aren't even the only queer characters in Persona 2, with side characters like Anna and Noriko also heavily implied to be gay. This isn't to say that all of the representation in Persona 2 is great. For example, there are a couple of NPCs that are heavily implied to be trans and are not treated well at all, and that can't be excused. This treatment of trans characters can be seen as a clear precursor to Beautiful Lady in Persona 3. Aside from this, however, the rest of the representation in Persona 2 is mostly handled well and respectfully. So what changed between Innocent Sin having one of the 3 serious romance options be gay, and the next 3 mainline titles not having any traces of same-sex options except for the scrapped remnants of gay Yosuke? Turns out there might be one person we can blame. Katsura Hashino, the man who you may remember from saying he wanted Persona 5 to represent those oppressed by generational traditions, happens to have become series director for Persona starting with 3 and carrying on since then for 4 and 5. And as you'd know if you've been paying attention, that means he's been in charge of every Persona game in the last 18 years without gay romance, and also just happens to have very little to do with the 25-year-old game that did have it. I and a lot of other people have fallen for the trap of, this is it then, Hashino's to blame, case closed. And while I think it's worth looking at the influence Hashino has had on Persona, I don't think it's productive to treat him as a homophobic overlord empowered by Atlus to try and make us forget about Tatsuya and his boyfriend.
Before Hashino, we had a canon female protagonist and non-offensive LGBTQ representation. I don't blame fans for thinking that Hashino might be homophobic and misogynist.
A thread on Reset Era became momentarily controversial for being pretty ruthless and systematically going through the problematic elements of the games Hashino's directed. This of course includes Persona 3's Beautiful Lady on the Beach, Yosuke's homophobia and the mishandling of Kanji's characterization from 4, the Shinjuku gays from 5, but this list also adds a divisive representation of trans characters in both versions of Catherine, a different Atlus title that Hashino directed. Laid out like this, yeah, it's pretty damning. This list includes almost everything that Hashino has his name on, so you've got to at least admire his consistency, but can we know that he's to blame? On the credits next to director, it doesn't say responsible for all the bigotry as well. And that's a complicated thing about games. There isn't just one person we can tack everything onto. It's not like a book where there is one main person responsible for everything creative. Games, and by extension movies and TV, have whole teams of people with their hands on different parts. So if anything, if you want to find who's directly responsible, then looking at writers would likely be more fruitful. But even so, the director is still responsible for the image of a game. They're supposed to have supervision over the final product and the process of getting there, giving it their stamp of approval. So even if Hashino might not have been in the writer's room saying, and then the homos in Shinjuku will drag Ryuji away and do unthinkable things to him, it'll be hilarious, he did play through that scene and every other scene and say the game is ready to ship. Hashino's influence over future Persona games is a different story though. He, alongside a team of Persona veterans, have not been working on Persona 6, but instead have been working on Metaphor ReFantasio, releasing this October. This game will of course have a lot of similarities to Persona, but it's also very much its own thing outside of the franchise. In an extended discussion about this upcoming title, the topic of Hashino and his time with Persona inevitably arose, and no punches were pulled.
It's completely irrelevant if Hashino is an open bigot and talks about it in interviews or not. The media he's directed has plenty of problematic content, and that's what I'm talking about. It stems from him having extremely conservative, archaic and patrimonialistic views of the world, while thinking of his games as some kind of revolutionary ode to social progress.
One user even surmised why the Persona series continues to have queer fans in spite of everything.
I admittedly can't say I'm as bothered by his writing choices as I probably should be as a queer person. They'd probably bother me a lot more if his games weren't so damn long. A handful of instances of homophobia and transphobia don't really stick out as much as they probably should when the entire game is 100 hours long, and I don't even see them all since I never do all of the social links.
I'm in the same boat. I love these games, but that's because these moments don't dominate them. However, they're disappointing nonetheless when they show up, and the impact of these moments, even if they're infrequent, should be noted.
This is part of a grand scope of how media portrays people, and it does have effects in reality, because it normalises it. I've seen such denialism that queer people either don't exist in Japan and it's been imported, or it's not that bad, stop complaining, among other things. Unfortunately, Atlus has a long history of issues that normalise this crap, and if anyone tries to push back at us calling this out, that says more on you than us.
And that's the problem. Concerns about the way Persona treats queer people is so often treated as whining or not that deep, but the real issue is that it accumulates to become the normalization this user is talking about. That's part of the reason why shutting down conversation about any of the queer elements of Persona is so common. But is this just a problem with Hashino and Persona, or is the blame with Atlus? Before moving on to the wider spectrum of Atlus games, it's worth giving a bit more attention to Catherine, since Hashino has directed both the original title and the definitive edition, Catherine Full Body. They're both worth noting because of the way the characters Erika and Rin are treated, both of which have been heavily documented by people who've actually played the games, and are largely critiqued for relying on the same trans panic trope we saw back in Persona 3. I'd recommend checking out other people's discussions about these games, since I'm the furthest thing from an authority on them, but it's worth noting that the way Beautiful Lady was treated in the first 3 versions of Persona 3 was not a one-off for games Hashino directed. So, how do other Atlus games that Hashino doesn't have as much of a say over fare? My initial instinct was to look at Shin Megami Tensei, Persona's parent franchise. To my surprise, there is incredibly little to speak for. What I've seen is small references on a similar scale to Mitsuru's obsessed NPC in Persona 3. Ironically, if you look up Shin Megami Tensei queer or gay or anything similar, most of the results that come up will be about Persona instead. When talking about other Atlus games that feature queer representation, a title that frequently comes up is 2019's collaboration between Vanillaware and Atlus, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. It's one of my favourite games I played a couple years ago, so I'm happy to get any chance to talk about it, but I will try and avoid spoilers since the meat of this game is its deep, complicated and detailed story, and the more blind you go in, the better time you'll have. However, what I can say is that the game presents a romantic relationship between playable character Takatoshi and arguably the most important unplayable character, Tsukasa. While Takatoshi originally thinks Tsukasa is female, it's soon revealed that Tsukasa is ambiguously gender non-conforming. Unlike some other Atlus titles, this is treated much more sensitively throughout 13 Sentinels, and while it's not perfect, you can tell a lot of attention has been put into making their relationship unique and engaging, while also feeling believable. So that's a point for Atlus. On the other hand, this year's Unicorn Overlord, which also happens to be another collaboration between Vanillaware and Atlus, disappointed queer fans by not including same-sex romance as an option. Kinda. The game gives you the option for the male protagonist Elaine to give a character a ring to romance them, and even though you were given the option to give the ring to male characters, you're only really confirmed as bromantic, whereas with almost all the female characters this is treated as marriage, even with the characters that are related to the main character.
So gay Elaine? No. Incest Elaine? Yes.
I've seen people say that some of the male options have implied romance, but that implication is all we really get. Aside from these though, there just isn't much queerness in Atlus games aside from Persona. Sure, this person thinks Soul Hackers is gay, some people got confused about the gender of Shin Megami Tensei 5's protagonist, Marion from Etrian Odyssey said this, but ironically Atlus's poster child for queer representation, both bad and occasionally good, is Persona. The reason I bring up Hashino is because, like I said earlier, he's often blamed for the state of queer representation in Persona, and I can see where that comes from. Persona's queer representation was in one state before him and is in a different one after. Also, almost every other Atlus game barely acknowledges queer people, except Catherine, which he also happened to direct as well, and then that starts a whole other discussion about the state of Catherine. But he's also just some guy who worked on some games. Not to devalue his work, the modern trilogy are great games, questionable writing moments aside, but since he doesn't work on Persona anymore, at least for now, that's the bookend. Even if I'm interested to see how Metaphor turns out, since so far it looks promising. Without him though, that doesn't mean that Atlus is going to go gay crazy and include 7 Juns and a Noriko or 2 in every Persona game. And like many people have pointed out, Persona is a JRPG, and mainstream Japanese games just don't embrace queer culture. Turns out, JRPGs are getting gayer. Need Proof, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, the 2 biggest JRPG series, both featured prominent queer characters in their most recent entries. Dion was arguably the best written character in Final Fantasy XVI, with believable, engaging development throughout the narrative, and also has a boyfriend. And while Sylvando from Dragon Quest XI doesn't look at the camera and say, "I'm a homosexual," he doesn't really need to. And like Dion, he gets an incredibly sympathetic narrative throughout the game with really strong characterization. Sure, he's more of a caricature, but at least he's not a rapist. If we're looking for JRPGs that give you romance options, last year's remake of Star Ocean Second Story retained the original same-sex romance options, no matter if you're playing as a male or female protagonist. And while more of a strategy game than a JRPG, it is Japanese and does feature RPG mechanics. Every new Fire Emblem game for the last decade has offered same-sex romance options, with the most recent completely unlocking the romance options so no matter which gender you play as, you can romance any of the characters. Even looking outside of Japan to RPGs from other Asian countries, Eternights, a Korean action RPG that takes clear inspiration from Persona, had a male romance option. With this game being pretty centered on romance, you can't even get the good ending if you don't romance someone, and the fact that there are only 4 romance options to begin with, this inclusion is actually pretty impactful. I could keep going, but you can see why the suggestion that Japanese games, or Eastern games in general, won't ever acknowledge queerness is pretty nonsensical. But I get it, not all JRPGs are created equal, and Japan isn't some monolith. Different studios will gravitate towards inclusion in different ways. Sure, Persona had gay romance all the way back in 1999 with Innocent Sin, but in the quarter of a century since then, there hasn't been much of a hint that they would include anything like that, especially recently. The most recent Persona spin-off game that isn't a gacha game, Persona 5 Tactica, is a strategy title that takes place during the story of Persona 5, and while its canon status is debated, leaning on the side of canon from what I've seen, it follows all the established characters acting as they usually do. While it's not a massive moment in the game, there is a point where Joker is given the option to imagine himself getting married to one of the party members. This list includes Ryuji and Yusuke, and contrary to what you might expect, neither of these scenes are played for laughs. Sure, both of the short scenes have jokes in them. Yusuke is accidentally inappropriate, as he tends to be, and Ryuji asks about toilet paper, but the joke isn't that they're both men. Like the female characters, they have unique sprites for their wedding outfits and imply a romantic relationship. Ryuji even calls Joker the person of his dreams.
I braced myself as I chose Ryuji, ready for Tactica to hit me with a metaphorical backhand in the form of my would-be boyfriend jolting away in the opposite direction. But it never came.
The scene ends, and the game continues as normal. This small scene in a spin-off shows the Persona franchise acknowledging the possibility of a same-sex romance, and it came out in late 2023, but there is a difference between a one-off scene in a spin-off and a full canon romance in a mainline game. So would Atlus actually take the dive? If, for example, Persona 6 launched tomorrow and had same-sex romance options, would that alienate some fans? Definitely. Would it harm sales? Unlikely. One of the biggest reasons that I've seen people accredit to Persona not including mainline same-sex romance is that it would alienate fans and potentially harm sales. But if we take a step back, we can see that's very unlikely. If Persona 6 only let you play as a gay character and forces you into a gay-only romance route, then that would be one thing, but that's not going to be the case. When people mention gay romance in Persona, they're usually expecting either one or two of the same-sex social links to allow romance, or perhaps just unlocking romance no matter the gender of the protagonist. Sure, this would potentially annoy some of the homophobic Persona fans, but I doubt to the point of actually not buying the game. You're probably going to see the same people who said they would boycott Persona 5 Royal for taking out the Shinjuku gays repeat a similar sentiment saying that they don't want a woke Persona, but that boycott is likely going to be as ineffective as the boycott of Royal was, as in non-existent. This didn't just happen for Royal. People said that the Pride pin meant Reload was ruined, but they still bought it, and people are saying they'll cancel their pre-orders for Metaphor ReFantasio because fantasy diversity might be a theme, but I doubt that's going to have a big impact either. If they can play the game and just ignore the same-sex romance option, then they will buy it, even if they get on a forum and talk about how wokeness is ruining gaming. It's why I roll my eyes so heavily when people say go woke, go broke, especially when talking about gaming, because it literally means nothing. Like Final Fantasy XVI was gay enough to get banned in multiple countries, but still sold well. And an even bigger example is a game like Baldur's Gate 3, which received near universal critical praise and sold incredibly well, all while featuring wholly gender-unlocked romance and multiple hard-to-miss queer NPCs. Sure, some progressive games might flop, but that's not because they're progressive. You'll hear Saints Row 2022 underperformed because of its diverse cast of main characters, but in reality it underperformed because the game, unfortunately, just wasn't very good. Back to Persona 6, so there isn't really any reason for Atlus to not include a gay romance in some capacity, but is there any reason for them to go out of their way to include it? Aside from the fact that in the grand scheme, it wouldn't take too much effort to script a couple of the same-sex social links to include romance, I also think from a capitalistic sense, it would build back goodwill that Atlus had lost from queer Persona fans. As I've examined, plenty of fans of the Persona series have a weird relationship with the franchise because of how it's treated queerness, especially in the modern trilogy. This has led to some people taking a step away from getting as involved with the series, and has also put off some people from even getting into it. If you're interested in the series, and do a quick check to look up if the games will let you romance same-gender characters, and then immediately show no alongside decades of discourse, then that might put you off. But if Atlus all of a sudden sell a Persona game that lets you have even one gay romance option, those search engine results would immediately change. As it stands in mid-2024, the lid has been tight on leaks for Persona 6, so there is nothing really official to base any guesses on. However, Atlus have very little to lose and quite a bit to gain from including queer romance. Of course, the quality of the game will be what contributes most to the game's potential success, but in isolation, I would say including it makes more sense. However, if you've learned anything, we know that Atlus won't always do what makes the most sense. I hate to be that person, but when I answered both yes and no to Persona being gay, I meant it. Of course it is. One of the free romance options in Persona 2 was a gay option, and while the series hasn't included same-sex romance since, queer theming and subtext has been present in some capacity throughout the modern trilogy, including spin-off titles. But of course it isn't. There hasn't been a same-sex romance option in 25 years, and the series has a history of negative representation of queer characters. It's an annoyingly consistent theme with Persona, but there are no clear answers. That's why predicting the fate of queerness in Persona 6 isn't simple. I can't draw a line in the sand because Atlus won't either. I think they're just as aware of the queer content in their games as they are of their conscious decision to not commit to wholehearted inclusion in the modern trilogy. Concluding is tricky because I haven't really got the means to conclude. I could summarize and say this is what's in Persona 3, Persona 4, 5 and 2, and here's what could be in Persona 6, but you've already heard it from me already, and if you want to hear it again, I trust you know how to skip back in the video. What I can say is I'm interested to see how the two future Atlus titles turn out. While Metaphor ReFantazio is not a Persona game, and for what I've seen it doesn't feature romance, it still has characters, and it's still being worked on by influential Persona veterans, of course including Hashino. He could continue his weird obsession of directing games with a sprinkling of derogatory jokes, he could change gears towards more respectful representation, or maybe it'll be completely neutral. Either way, I'm going to play it because it looks fun, but I'll keep an eye out while I enjoy myself. And then there's Persona 6, which I've covered, but whenever it launches I'll get my actual answer. But even then, Atlus could give the most conclusive, explicit statement, and it would still take divine intervention to get Persona fans to stop arguing. Thanks for kind of getting to the end of this series, or if you've only watched this one part then thanks for that. In 2 weeks I'm going to upload all 4 videos together in one mega video since that's how I originally wrote it. But in uploading it like this, I've already got some amazing feedback as well as people reminding me of what I might have overlooked or anything that needs some extra attention. Because of this, at the end of the big video I'll be including an extra section before the outro going over some of these points. I'm of course not going to be able to cover everything, but if there's something you really think I overlooked in all 4 of these videos and want to make sure I get it in the final cut, then leave a comment. Thanks again and see you in 2 weeks.